Okay, so welcome everyone in presence and online. So for this workshop on science and astrology in China and Japan, so we'll be enjoying the company of Jeffrey Kotyk, who has been studying this kind of transmission of astrology and the scientific in general science to the Far East. So Jeffrey has a long path in studies regarding Eastern philosophies, Eastern topics. His PhD dissertation is titled Buddhist Astrology and Astromagic in the Tang Dynasty, and addresses exactly some of the topics, or most of the topics we are addressing today. And he is now head of a project, Sino-Iran, who studies the transmission of scientific knowledge between Iran, Persia, and China, and all those exchanges of culture and, of course, science and scientific knowledge. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's my first time in Lisbon in Portugal, and I have to say I very much love this city. And I had some nata yesterday for the first time, and it was very, very nice. So, and the weather was just absolutely beautiful. So thank you very, very much for hosting me. So to give you some background information about my project, there we go. It's the Sino-Iran project, and we're focused on Sino-Iranian relations in the first millennium, so from 0 to 1,000. And it's presently hosted at the Department of Cultural Heritage at the University of Bologna in the city of Ravenna. And so it's presently funded by a Mary Curie Fellowship. And so we're looking at the transmission of sciences between Sasanian Iran and China in particular, and also the material culture as well, such as gemstones, metals, these sort of topics. And then we're also looking at astrology and astronomy as well. I have a website for more information about this. And there will be a forthcoming monograph of the Sino-Iran project, probably in 2024, that will be a comprehensive survey of Sino-Iranian relations in antiquity. Now, to jump in, we have to look at the origins of horoscopy. So horoscopy is a technical word, and it usually refers to what we call astrology, but it specifically means the casting of birth charts or nativities that indicate the positions of the planets. Astrology can mean different things to different people. In North America, for example, I'm Canadian. We tend to think of astrology as horoscopes, but horoscopes means I'm a Virgo, I'm a Leo, he's a Taurus, that sort of thing. But it's a lot more complicated than that because there's a lot of astronomy and science involved. And so the origins of Hellenistic horoscopy go back to the world of Ptolemaic Egypt, so Alexandria. And David Pingree, the famous scholar of the history of astrology and astronomy, he described Greco-Egyptian astrology as constituting a union of aspects of advanced Babylonian celestial divinations with Aristotelian physics and Hellenistic astronomy. So it's really, when we look at the history of astrology, it's a constant union of different traditions, whether it's Babylonian and Greek. And then as we proceed into history, we also have elements from India and also the Islamic world. So casting horoscopes. So the production of a horoscope requires the calculations of the positions of the planets and the stars. And we might take that for granted. Unless you have an interest in astronomy, you probably don't know the positions of the planets on a given night. So last night, Lewis and I were walking along the river, and we noticed that Venus was setting after the sun, and we could point out also Jupiter and Mars and so forth. But most people, if you don't have an interest in astronomy, the planets just are another star in the sky. So the origins of planetary knowledge, too, go back to Mesopotamia originally. So the first civilization to have systematic knowledge of the planetary movements was Babylon, Mesopotamia. The Chinese also discovered the planets on their own, independent of Mesopotamia. But for Western Eurasia, it was first the Babylonians who discovered it, and knowledge of the planets was transmitted to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Persians, and so on over time. And the other thing with horoscopy is that the client has to know the hour of their birth. So they have to live in a community where time is tracked. So in this way, it is probably more likely to be something amongst the aristocracy, the elites of society, or people with access to timekeeping, because we take that for granted as well, that you can know when you're born today because the hospital has a record of it, or your parents had a watch and they kept track of the time. But in antiquity, it was much more difficult to keep track of time and to know the hour of your birth. So we're dealing with something that requires a certain environment. It can't just be done very simply in a rural environment. So why cast horoscopes? Well, there's two types of astrology. There's natal astrology, and that predicts an individual's life. So if you look at my birth chart, for example, you can look at some details and predict that I will have these sort of challenges in life, these sort of fortunes in life. I might suffer from these sort of diseases. And then there's also electional astrology or Kotyk astrology, and that attempts to determine opportune times for various activities. So according to astrology, the tides of time are constantly shifting. And what that means is that if you want to carry out an action, like if you want to buy a house or get married, or even engage in a military operation, then you might want to consult the stars and see when is the best time. But what that means is that astrology is not 100% deterministic. It means that you actually have some control over your fate. So astrology assumes that many things are fated. That means many things obey fate and destiny. But at the same time, too, you have the opportunity to make some sort of movement within those limitations. So astrology is not entirely deterministic either, because you can also modify and affect fate according to your own actions. And so one of the core parts of astrology, of course, is the zodiac signs. And so the ecliptic, the celestial equator is divided into 360 degrees, as is the case today. So this number comes again from Mesopotamia. It's Mesopotamian mathematics. You find the number 360 also in Indian astronomy, but this came through Hellenistic astronomy. The Chinese, interestingly, traditionally never used 360 degrees to measure the celestial equator and the ecliptic. They used 365.25 days, and they divide it again into 365.25 degrees. And so that tracks the movements of the sun precisely. So you have different ways in different cultures, but in Western Eurasia, the Greek number, the Mesopotamian, and also the Indian number is 360 degrees. So you can divide that quite easily into 12 different sections, and those become the zodiac signs. And as we know, the zodiac signs are loosely based on the constellations, Aries, Sagittarius, and so forth. And this again goes back to Mesopotamia. As you probably know, there's also a difference between a sidereal zodiac and a tropical zodiac. So the sidereal zodiac, the first degree of Aries is defined according to the position of a star. And then the tropical zodiac, the first degree of Aries is defined according to the vernal equinox, where the sun rises in the springtime. And so what ends up happening is you have a divergence of these two zodiacs because the stars over time move due to the precession of the equinoxes. So 1 degree every 71.6 years. So you get a divergence between the sidereal and tropical zodiacs. So we have, in practice, in the history of astrology, we have the tropical zodiac and a sidereal zodiac, and astrologers from different time periods use either one. And the other thing is that we have the planets, of course. So the planets in Mesopotamia were associated with the names of gods. And you can see here in the Akkadian column, so Nergal, Nabu, Marduk, Ishtar, and Kayamanu. And this is important to keep in mind that the planets were regarded as divinities. So we also have to recall too in Plato that he thought of the stars as divine intelligences in Timaeus. So this sort of idea was also part of Greek culture as well. And it was also transmitted into the Persian tradition. So the Persians also named the planets after gods from their own pantheon, such as Tyr, Ahura Mazda, Anahit, Kewan. And this also was transmitted into Sogdian. And so Sogdian is an Eastern Iranian language that's similar to Persian, medieval Persian. And the names of the planets as well were translated into Chinese in some cases, using the Sogdian words. But the point here is that the planets were not regarded as just simply stars in the sky made of light, but they were seen as divine intelligences. And so astrology is also premised originally on the idea that the planets are gods and goddesses. And so they're like a actual visual manifestation of divinity. And so within that framework, you can observe the passage of fate, and you can also analyze a person's fate based on this configuration of the divinities in the heavens. And so this is very interesting. And then there's one exception to this, which is Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, the famous Greek astrologer and astronomer in Alexandria. He reconfigured astrology, so he started to view the planets as more material entities. So Mars is like fiery, for example, but it's no longer in this context really divinity, whereas an astrologer like Dorotheus of Sidon, a Hellenistic astrologer of the 1st century Common Era, viewed the planets as divinities. When you get into, like, for example, the history of Islam and Christianity, they tend to favor Claudius Ptolemy's interpretation because, in my opinion, probably because it avoids any sort of theist interpretation. You don't have to assume that the planets are gods, in which case it becomes a form of natural science. So the form of astrology that Europe was most familiar with in the medieval period and Renaissance was natural science. Whereas elsewhere in Asia, such as in Persia, in India, and China, the planets were categorically regarded as gods. But that also has a precedent too in the early Hellenistic period as well, with figures like Dorotheus of Sidon and others. And another interesting custom that's connected to the history of astrology is the 7-day week. And so we use this today. So Lewis was telling me in Portuguese, the names of the weekdays are not named after planets. Whereas like in French and Italian, for example, Monday is lunedì, so the moon day, Venerdì, Friday, Venus day, and so forth. And so this also goes back to a Greco-Egyptian tradition. And it's a union of Greek cosmological, the concept of concentric spheres, and the Egyptian concept of deities presiding over each of the 24 seasonal hours. So you have what's called the Chaldean ordering of the planets. And so it runs in the order of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Moon. And that order is basically, if you're watching the planets from Earth, it's from the slowest planets to the fastest planets. So Mars has an orbital period of about 30 years, whereas the Moon has an orbital period of 1 month, roughly speaking. So it's from the slowest to the fastest. And so this also is a Babylonian order. And so if you arrange the planets in this sort of sequence, the first hour of Sunday is ruled by the sun, and then the subsequent hour, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and so forth. And so Monday, the first hour will be ruled by the moon, Tuesday, Mars, et cetera, et cetera. And so in this system as well, the first hour is actually at sunrise. So this model is the day begins at sunrise and it ends at the following sunrise. So it's not midnight as in 12 o'clock a.m. as we have in modern timekeeping. So the concept of the 7-day week was introduced to China around the 7th century, but the planetary hours are not attested. So you could have the 7-day week, as is much the case today, without having any knowledge of the planetary hours. But in antiquity, in the Hellenistic tradition, and also in the medieval tradition, there was more attention paid to the planetary hours because each of them signal or signify things that are important if you're doing electional astrology. So for example, if it is the hour of Saturn on a Saturday, this is probably not a good day to get married because Saturn is associated with celibacy, monks, death, loneliness, those sort of topics. So it'd be more auspicious to get married, for example, at an hour of the sun or the hour of Venus, for example. And also, I mean, the reason that Dominica Sunday is the holy day as well probably goes back to astrology as well. So in the Manichaean and the Persian Zoroastrian tradition, Sunday was considered especially auspicious because it's associated with the sun. And so it was considered a holy day in those traditions as well. So I assume that probably Christianity early on decided to use Sunday as the holy day, whereas the Jewish tradition uses Saturday as the Sabbath. So there's a lot of history involved in this. So some of the key figures in early astrology, and which are relevant to the Chinese tradition, is Dorotheus of Sidon and Claudius Ptolemy. Dorotheus of Sidon, his work was originally written in Greek, but unfortunately we don't have the original text, but we have an Arabic translation of it. And in recent years, what's been discovered is that there was a version of Dorotheus of Sidon translated into Chinese, which we'll discuss. And this material was really the foundation for much of Chinese astrology, Chinese horoscopy anyway, and also Claudius Ptolemy. So Ptolemy's work was probably more prolific in the Islamic and the Christian worlds than Dorotheus historically. So in medieval Europe, most astrologers would have firstly studied the Tetrabiblos, which is the sort of key manual for astrology as a natural science. But there's also, in our story of astrology, especially as astrology goes eastwards, we have to look at Indian astrology. So ancient India had its own native form of astrology based primarily on the moon. But from the 4th or 5th century, India imported Hellenistic horoscopy from abroad. This is a bit of a contentious issue because in modern India, there's some people who propose and argue that horoscopy based on texts such as the Yavana Jataka and so forth has a native Indian origin, and also the advanced mathematical astronomy of antiquity in India was independently developed from anything in the Greek-speaking world. But then the issues with that too is that Indian astrology around the 4th or 5th century has a lot of Greek loanwords in it, like the word hora from horoscopy, hour, hora. So there's a bit of a divide between how some scholars in India understand this history compared to, for example, how David Pingree understands the history of astrology. I tend to favor David Pingree's version of the history. So Indian astronomy and astrology imports Greek materials around the 3rd or 4th century Common Era, and then you have Indian horoscopy develop. And then Buddhist literature also reveals a gradual introduction of astrology over time. So there's some astrological elements in early Buddhist literature. It's not a core part, it's not a very important part of early Buddhism, but it's still there. But then Buddhist literature, there's very, very, very many Buddhist texts. And over time, you can actually see the gradual introduction of things like the Zodiac signs and the planets and so forth. So in ancient India, in the Vedas and in the Buddhist canon, the earliest Buddhist canon, there's no references to the planets, the 5 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, etc. And those only appear very suddenly in the record of religious texts, starting around really like the 5th or the 6th century Common Era at the earliest. And so what that tells us is that there was no systematic knowledge of the planets early on, and that this sort of understanding was introduced gradually over time. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Again, we take for granted knowledge of the planets today, but in antiquity, that wasn't necessarily the case. So there's 2 concepts that are really important to the indigenous form of Indian astrology, which is the Pakshas and the nakshitras. So originally, the Indian month was divided into 2 parts, Paksha. This word is a Sanskrit word, and it's probably etymologically related to like the word part in English. So it's 2 parts, Paksha. And then there's the waxing period, the Shukla Paksha, and the waning period, the Krishna Paksha. So the white part and the black part. And both are constituted by 15 titis. And so a titi is a lunar day. So you can roughly divide 1 month into 30 titis. And each of these titis is also auspicious for various things or inauspicious. So this also has a religious or astrological signification as well. And a nakshitra is one of 27 or 28 constellations along the ecliptic through which the moon transits over 27.32 days. So when we talk about lunar mansions in the Indian context, this is what a nakshitra is. And there's, like originally there was 28, but then they modified it over time into 27. So you have the list of the nakshitras. This is the typical names of them. There's sometimes some variations on the names. And interestingly, the system originally commenced from Kritika, which is associated with the Pleiades constellation. And the Pleiades constellation about, I think it's 2000 BCE, was rising at the vernal equinox. So that's a good time to commence the ordering of the nakshatras. But the interesting thing about that is that that would considerably predate the the period of the Vedas. So it's been proposed that the nakshatra system might be indigenous to India, but it might be from before the Vedic tradition existed in India. So to give you some background, in ancient India, there was the Indus Valley civilization, which was contemporaneous. It existed around the same time as the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians, the ancient Egyptians. And we haven't deciphered their script, but in southern Pakistan and northern India, you have the cities such as Harappa and so forth. And the names of the nakshatras in some cases are difficult to understand from like a Sanskrit etymology. And so it's been proposed by some scholars that the nakshatras might also come from the Indus Valley civilization. The other reason for proposing this is that in the tradition of ancient Persia, the Avestan tradition, which is related to the Vedic tradition in terms of religious scriptures, you don't have the lunar mansions and nakshatras. So in the very ancient Persian religion, you don't have the nakshatras or lunar mansions. And also in other Indo-European traditions, such as the Celts, the Germans, and so forth, you don't have a system of lunar mansions like this. So they appear in this form, first in India, and then later on, you see them in like the Arabic tradition and so forth, but they're also attested in like the medieval Persian tradition, but not the very, very ancient Avestan literature. So the nakshatras are also an important part of the history of astrology, but they were also regarded as deities as well. So this is the mandala of the sun god Surya from, I think it's the medieval period in Nepal. And I got to see this in New York a few weeks ago. And because this mandala is depicting all of the different celestial deities, the nakshatras, the lunar mansions, are also depicted in this way as well. So they were treated as deities. So you can see here 4 of them in one of the corners. And that's an important thing to keep in mind too, is that it's not just the planets, but also the lunar mansions could be regarded as gods. So this is not just a purely scientific system of measuring the sky, but there's a lot of religious connotations, a lot of religious significance to everything involved in this. And this model also was carried over to China via Buddhism. And at the same time, too, we have to keep in mind that there was Iranian astrology. So the Iranian kings under the Sasanian dynasty in particular took a very deep interest in astrology. So we have records, for example, in the 3rd century, there was translations of Hellenistic astrology and Indian astrology into the Persian language. This is fairly late in the history of astrology, but nevertheless, the Sasanian dynasty took an interest in astrology. And this should also bring to mind some of the associations between Persians and astrology that stem from biblical literature, such as the Magi in Matthew in the Bible. So when Jesus is born, you have the 3 wise men, the Magi, the Magoi, and they're generally understood as Persians. And that's because in the Greek world, they associated Persians with astrology. Now, whether the Persian Magi were really practitioners of astrology or not is questionable, because when you look at the evidence, astrology was something of, in some cases, something of a taboo in Zoroastrianism, because the demons were associated with, or the planets were associated with demons. And it seems that the association between Magi and astrology is more something that stems from the Greek understanding, the Greek stereotypes, and not necessarily what the Zoroastrians themselves were necessarily doing. But late Zoroastrian literature also incorporates some Hellenistic and Indian astrological elements, such as like the Zodiac signs and the lunar mansions as well. And so this is important too to the story, because you have Iranian astrology and also Indian astrology entering China over time. So when we get to China, we have all of this history of astrology already evolved in Western Eurasia and South Asia. And then you start having a lot of connections between South Asia and also Central Asia and China. And there were 2 main avenues through which this knowledge came. There was the southern route through Southeast Asia, the maritime route, and then there was also the route over the Tarim Basin, so north of Tibet. And so that's what's understood often as the Silk Road. There was a lot more than silk that was traded along this route, but nevertheless, they call it the Silk Road. And the first instances of foreign astrology in China is actually through Buddhist literature. So the Buddhists were some of the first people, probably the first people to systematically translate foreign literature into Chinese. So they were the first translators. And some Buddhist literature has elements of Indian astrology in it. So the first evidence that I've been able to determine is around the 4th century when Dharmaraksha translated a text called the Shardulakarna Avadana, which is something of a divination manual. It's a Buddhist sutra that has a lot of divination attached to it. And so it talks about astrology. It talks about the omens associated with earthquakes and that sort of thing. And so this wasn't the main focus of Buddhism, but it was still a part of Buddhism. And this is something I've emphasized in my research in the past, is that Buddhists believed in astrology, although normally scholars of Buddhism don't recognize this, and modern Buddhist traditions are often reluctant as well to admit that Buddhism historically had a lot of astrology in it. This is kind of an interesting topic because scholars, researchers of Christianity, of Hinduism, of Judaism tend to recognize that, yes, astrology was part of these traditions, but scholars of Buddhism just tend to ignore that, which says something about I think the prejudices and biases of modern scholarship. At the same time, too, with the rationalism of the 20th century, a lot of modern Buddhist traditions as well don't really mention astrology, even when their texts talk about it. It's just sort of ignored and set aside rather than being directly addressed. There was also another recension of the Shardulakarna Apadana translated around the 5th century, and it was titled the Matanga Sutra. So anyways, the zodiac signs, the first evidence of zodiac signs in China is again in a Chinese Buddhist sutra from the 6th century. So when you have the list of the 12 zodiac signs, the Chinese is a transliteration of the Sanskrit. So they were translating the names of the zodiac signs using their Sanskrit names, such as Mesha and Simha and Kanya, Tula, etc. That's how they initially understood them. Now, in this case, they're not so important, but they're listed amongst the various sorts of celestial deities in the sky that are part of a larger pantheon of gods and goddesses, but they're still there. But this is also interesting, is that the zodiac signs are also treated as gods and goddesses, or probably, I would say probably more likely gods in the masculine. So the deification of zodiac signs seems to have occurred in India as well, whereas you don't have the deification of the zodiac signs in like the Hellenistic tradition, as far as I can see. So the people weren't necessarily seeing them as gods and goddesses. But in the Indian tradition, and particularly in the Buddhist tradition, the zodiac signs become gods. And then in another translation, the Surya Garbha Parivarta, which was also translated in the 6th century, you have semantic translation. So it's not a phonetic transliteration of the zodiac signs, but rather it's like a semantic. And if you translate the meanings of the words individually, you have like scorpion deity and water vessel deity, ram deity, that sort of thing. But at the time, the Chinese had no knowledge of the zodiac signs, so this was unfamiliar to them. And it was just part of like a sort of wider package of Buddhist information, of Buddhist knowledge that was coming through. But this also indicates the increasing significance of astrology to Buddhists, because they start talking about zodiac signs, they start talking about the planets. And so what that means is that astrologers were starting to be active in the Buddhist community. And this really accumulates around the 7th century with the advent of Mantrayana. Mantrayana, you might be familiar with it in the other term, which is Vajrayana. So for example, we can translate this kind of as esoteric Buddhism. And so this is, a very complicated forms of Buddhist ritual that require all sorts of instruments like a bell and a vajra, which is like a thunderbolt, and music and incense and all sorts of other sort of ritual items that you have to use to do these very vast, complex rituals. But this new system actually required observance of astrology in order to time rituals. So before, in the past, Buddhist rituals didn't require astrological timing to this extent. But suddenly around the 7th century, with the invention of this new Buddhist practice, you have to time things according to astrology. But in order to do that, you either have to have access to an astrologer or you have to study the subject yourself. So one of the early scriptures of this tradition, the Mahavarochana Sutra, so the scripture of Mahavarochana, it says, on the morning of a propitious day, having determined a day on which the time, lunar mansion, and planets are all in harmony, and at a time before the morning meal with an auspicious sign, then you can carry out the ritual. So it's telling you that you have to determine an auspicious or a lucky day and a lucky time in order to carry out the ritual. Otherwise, the ritual might not be successful. So this is proposing a form of electional astrology. And so this is a really important development in Buddhism. And so there was an Indian monk who came to China in the early 7th century. His name was Shubhakara Simha. And there's actually a portrait of him you can see here. So he's dressed in his robes and he has an incense burner and he has a beard and the elongated earlobe. So he's an Indian monk. And he produced a commentary which was translated into Chinese around the year 724. And he gives information about astrology as he understood it. So it's not like a complex manual, but he's giving you basically a general outline of what astrology for an Indian monk would have meant at the time. And he says there are 9 graha, graspers. So this is the Sanskrit word for planet, the graha, because the planets are thought to grasp onto things and influence them. So the sun, the moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, the 7 luminaries. If combined with Rahu and Ketu, they together comprise 9 graha. Rahu is the nodal eclipse deity, and Ketu is directly translated as banner. The banner star is a comet. Apart from these 2 planets, the other 7 have their sequential convergences. So he's talking about the days of the week. Their qualities also differ in being either benefic or malefic, as it is explained in the Indian calendar. So this is there's a lot that he's explaining here. So he's talking about the planets, but also the Rahu and Ketu. So Rahu is the ascending node of the moon. And originally, though, Rahu was the demon in the Vedas who grasps onto the moon and causes eclipses. So he is said to grasp onto and devour the sun and the moon. So you get like the eclipse running over the sun or the moon. But Ketu originally meant comets. And later, only later in Indian astronomy is Ketu associated with the descending node of the moon. So Rahu is the head of the eclipse deity, and then Ketu is the tail of the eclipse deity. And that's something you see in Arabic astrology, and then later on also in European astrology, the head and the tail of the dragon, which sprawls across the sky. But originally in the Indian context, Ketu just meant comets. So they understood comets as maybe some sort of anomalous planet that would appear and disappear over time. And then only later was it associated with the descending node of the moon. And he's also talking about the 7-day week. But all he says is, as it is explained in the Indian calendar. But if you're a monk in China in the year 724, and there's no adequate translations of all of this material into Chinese, you can't do very much with it yet. You've heard like a general outline of it, but you don't have any sort of, solid material. If you worked for the Chinese court, if you're like a high-ranking monk, you have Indians working at the Chinese court, Indian astronomers, and they can tell you all about this sort of thing. And it's probably very helpful, but not for common people. But astrology becomes also important as part of the ritual apparatus. So you have the Garbhadhatu mandala, which is the mandala that's associated with this specific text, the Mahavarochana Sutra. And when you first look at it, it doesn't look like there's anything astrological about this, because in the center is a Buddha surrounded by other Buddhas, and then all these other Buddhist figures that surround them. But what's interesting is that on the outer ring of the mandala, you actually have the zodiac signs and the planets. And they were considered to be part of the cosmos, so they were put there on the outer ring. And there's this one, it's actually like a scroll. There's one text in Japan called the Taizo Zuzo, so like the illustrations of the Garbhadhatu mandala. It preserves the original illustrations that you're supposed to use when drawing the mandala. So you have all of these different figures. There's Buddhas, there's Bodhisattvas, there's Ganesh, there's Brahma, Indra, but you also have the zodiac signs there too. And so there was originally like this iconography manual that was produced in China, and it reproduces the Indian icons. And this was carried over to Japan sometime in like maybe the 8th or the 9th century. But we can see here some very familiar zodiac signs. So you can see, for example, Leo the lion, Aries the ram, Taurus the bull, Cancer the crab, and so forth. So it's all very, very familiar. And you also have, for example, Sagittarius there, which is a very early example in China, maybe even like maybe the only example in antiquity in the medieval period of Sagittarius being depicted with the bottom of a horse after the centaur. So it's a very sudden introduction of this iconography. So China is suddenly given this iconography, and it's within Buddhism. But you also have some interesting figures like this. So this is called a Makara, and it's actually how Capricorn was understood in India originally. And so, as you know, Capricorn is supposed to be a fish goat. So in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and then also in the Greek tradition, you have Capricorn as a fish goat. So the bottom of a fish and the top of a goat. But in India, they interpreted this as like a giant fish. And there's two different interpretations of what a Makara is. So it could be maybe a crocodile, an alligator, or possibly a dolphin. And I think the artist here was probably attempting to draw a dolphin. So you have like this funny nose, and probably because the artist had never actually seen a dolphin, and they didn't have, access to like an accurate drawing of a dolphin. So he was trying to reproduce what a dolphin looked like based on an earlier Indian example. And so in China, the Makara Capricorn just becomes a giant fish. And then you also have the planets depicted in anthropomorphic forms like this. So originally in China, the planets were not depicted as people, not as animals, but rather they weren't depicted. They were understood as elements. So Jupiter is the wood star, and Mars is the fire star, Venus is the metal star. So they were understood as elements. They were associated with elements rather than being, strictly speaking, any sort of gods or divinities. But Buddhism had incorporated the planets into their pantheon as deities, and that's why we see them in the mandala in this form. So you have, you can see Mars, he's holding a spear, and then you also have Rahu and Ketu. So Rahu is a decapitated head, because according to the Hindu traditions, the Vedic traditions, various stories have Rahu losing his head. I think it's Vishnu who decapitates him. And so he's still, still has his hands, and he's trying to grasp onto the sun and the moon. And then Ketu was originally associated with comets, and they understood that as sort of like smoky. As they when you look at a comet, you can sort of see a tail on it. And so they interpreted that as a sort of smoke. And so Ketu was associated with smoke, and the coloring as well of smoke. But then you also have, in this case too, the first example in China of the sun chariot being depicted. So Surya, the sun god, in the Vedic tradition, rides in a chariot pulled by horses. And then the moon rides in a chariot pulled by geese. In some traditions, in the Hindu tradition, sometimes the moon is pulled by a chariot of white horses, but in this case, he's pulled by a chariot of geese, of white geese. And there's precedent for that in some Sanskrit literature and at least one Purana text as well. But in any case, this is the sort of familiar iconography. We also might think of Helios in Greek mythology pulled in a chariot of horses. And then on the moon, you also have the association with the rabbit or the hare. So he has his crescent moon, and then there's the hare on top of that. And so in India, they saw a hare on the moon. And interestingly, also in China, independent of India, they also saw a hare or a rabbit in the moon as well. And so that's why you see the rabbit there. And then you also have the depictions of the lunar mansions, nakshitras, in this way. They're not necessarily so distinct from one another. They tend to hold lotuses, which is a characteristic of the sun god. But in this case, they're holding lotuses. This sort of iconography is also somewhat unclear of like where it comes from. and some of the associations with it, just because of a lack of evidence. So the Chinese iconography of astrology is very important to us because it gives us a sort of snapshot of what was available in India at the time. So Amoghavajra, he is a famous Buddhist monk from after Shubhakara Simha's time. He was born in Samarkand in Central Asia, and he moved to China as youth, and he was a prolific translator and cleric at the Chinese court. And he produced a manual, which you can translate as the scripture of asterisms and planets, first in 759, and he subsequently revised it in 764. And so there was a need in the Chinese Buddhist community in particular to understand Indian astrology in a way that would be accessible to monks who didn't know Sanskrit, because reading Sanskrit was a challenge if you didn't have a background or access to it. So they needed something in Chinese. So he produced the first manual. And so even when you look at this page, even if you don't understand Chinese, if you're familiar with astrology, you see 12 divisions and so forth. So you're like, oh, okay, there's something here regarding astrology. And so that's a table of the 12 zodiac signs in Chinese. The first known example, the first extant example of a horoscope table, or a horoscope table is in this document. And it gives us a lot of astrological lore, particularly from an Indian background, but also some things from the zodiac signs. So one of the nakshitras is Ashlesha. And so my translation of this part, it is formed like the head of a serpent. Its deity is Shesha, eat python flesh. When the moon transits this nakshitra, carry out aggressive acts, attack rebels, eliminate the wicked, besiege cities, destroy foes, and conquer the realm. So this is supposed to be a Buddhist text, but it's also giving you instructions in warfare. So I think the reason for this is because Amoghavajra was not translating Buddhist literature so much as he was translating Indian astrology and then putting it into a Buddhist manual. And as a result of that, you have things like this, where it's advising you on military matters. So for a Buddhist monk, it's not very helpful to read something that says besiege cities or attack the wicked. But nevertheless, this is an important Chinese translation of Indian astrology. And the interesting thing about this text is it also starts giving us the first evidence of like natal astrology in China. So the ancient forms of Chinese omenology was not horoscopy. So the ancient, like going back into deep antiquity, like 500 BCE, the Chinese also looked at the stars and they also saw omens in the sky, but that was only relevant to the emperor or the king and the court and the realm as a whole. So it wasn't something that meant anything to an individual, like their individual fate. But then with Indian astrology, they start talking about everybody's individual fate. So if you know when you're born, if you know under which of the lunar mansions you were born, then you can start talking about what your fate means to you individually and what's likely to happen over the course of your lifetime. So there's this one doctrine that's explained in the text, and it translates as basically like, 3 sets of 9 method, which is actually attested in Jyotish or Indian astrology, the Tara Bala, Tara Chakra, Navatara. And it basically works like this, where the nakshatra in which the moon is positioned becomes associated with life, and the moon's transits through the remaining nakshatras are treated according to their fixed assignments like this. So this is comparable to the 12 houses. And I'll talk about the 12 houses shortly. If you're familiar with astrology, then you know the 12 houses. So you have the life sign, which will be the lunar mansion in which the moon was positioned when you're born. So for example, if my lunar mansion is Ashvini, then that means my life lunar mansion will always be Ashvini. And so when the moon every month transits through Ashvini, then it's associated with this life. And then when it goes to the following lunar mansion is associated with prosperity and decay and so forth. And so the moon throughout the month will have different significations for me as an individual, which might be different from you because you were born under a different lunar mansion. And so this was really new, innovative ideas for the Chinese at the time because they didn't have any form of divination or astrology like this. So suddenly astrologers can tell you about your fate. And it starts to become increasingly really, really popular. I think first it starts with the aristocracy because they get a hold of this and they're really fascinated by it, and they want to learn more about this. So this probably explains why within a generation, they started translating astrology from Iranian sources. So sometime after 764, Iranian horoscopy was introduced into China, likely through the Sogdians. Again, the Sogdians are an Eastern Iranian people related to the Persians, but they're not Persian. And there was this one text that's extant. It's roughly translates. The title is kind of obscure, but it translates as The Secrets of the Seven-Planet Apotropeism. And it includes the basic tools necessary to cast a horoscope and interpret it. And what I think is that the reason that they very suddenly started translating horoscopy into Chinese was because of this Buddhist interest initially. So Buddhism is saying we need astrology to time rituals, but you can also determine your fate based on astrology. And so suddenly they want this sort of thing translated. And then in this one text, we have another example of a horoscope table like this, but this is much, much more detailed. And I've translated the table and you can look at some of the details here. And so you have the 12 house divisions, such as, fate, wealth, brothers, estate, children, servants, marriage, illness, travel, career, fortune, hardships. So the 12 house divisions. So if you're familiar with astrology, you recognize that as the 12 house divisions. And then it also gives you the domiciles. So for example, Taurus is associated with Venus and Pisces is associated with Jupiter. So astrological doctrines are very quickly, within a couple of years, translated into Chinese. And it seems that there's like a local tradition of astrology springing up around this time. So sometime between 764 and around 800 or so, they start practicing this sort of astrology. And we can actually trace some of the figures who were involved in this transmission. So there's the history of the Tang Dynasty. The history of the Tang Dynasty was one of the Chinese regimes or dynasties that was from about 618 to about 906, 907. And so there was this one text called the Duli Jing, and it was two fascicles. And sometime between 785 and 805, a figure named Li Mi-qian transmitted it from Western India. And there was someone named Chu Gong who translated the text. Now, although it says Western India, we have to keep in mind that that was a border region between the Iranian world and the Indian world. And after the collapse of the Sasanian dynasty in the mid-7th century, around the year 650, 655 or so, there were a lot of ethnic Persians who migrated into what's now Western India. So even if it says Western India, we can't always assume that it's like a Sanskrit tradition. We have to keep in mind that that was a border region between the Sanskrit or the Indic world and the Persian world. And there might have actually been a Nestorian Christian connection in this regard. So there was a figure named Li Su, who appears to have been a Nestorian Christian clergyman, and he was appointed to the Bureau of Astronomy sometime around 766 to 779. And so his courtesy name, which is a Chinese concept where you have your official name and then you have a sort of formal name. So his name appears on the Nestorian stele of 781. So there's a stele, like a monument to the Christian church that was created in China in the year 781, and Li Su's name appears on it. And Li Su was a court astronomer. So what that means is that he was probably a Christian clergyman, a priest, or a monk of some sort, but at the same time too, he worked for the Chinese court as an astronomer. So there was probably some sort of connection there. And we know that also in the Arabic world as well, that there were Christians who also operated as astrologers as well, because the Nestorian or the East Syriac church was favorable towards astrology in a way that was less the case, I think, in the Roman Catholic Church. And then moving on, you also have the translation of Arabic astrology into China, sometime in the Mongol Yuan dynasty. So it's relatively later that you have Arabic astrology. So the Al-Madkhal by Kushar ibn Laban was translated sometime again around the late 14th, early 15th century. And this was just translated, the book of astronomy translated in the Ming. But it's a very important text because it draws on Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. So this is the first example where the work of Claudius Ptolemy is translated into Chinese. And this court was also used by astrologers outside the court. And so it gives you really basically an overview of the Tetrabiblos. And it also follows some Arabic astrological conventions as well. So the introduction of Arabic astrology comes relatively later in Chinese history. And then once we get to the late Ming Dynasty in the 16th century, we have a very robust form of a tradition of astrology, very long texts. You have like some astrology texts in Chinese, which are like 40 volumes or 40 chapters rather, about 40 chapters, which is quite long. And it covers everything. It covers the houses, it covers the zodiac signs, it covers just everything. And we also have some Chinese authors from around this time who even complain that like gentlemen scholars are spending way too much time on this astrology. And they're also saying that it's kind of a waste of time because it's actually came from foreign countries and it doesn't have any sort of roots in deep antiquity, that it's not like a tradition that is associated with the true classics of scholarly learning. So it really has a very diverse history, a very, very long history. And in the history of Chinese literature and Chinese religions, a lot of this really hasn't been recognized. The significance of astrology hasn't really been widely recognized. Now, moving into some of the more technical aspects of all of this. So Chinese astronomy uses 28 sidereal lunar stations, which is different from the Indian nakshitras, and it divides the ecliptic into 365.25 degrees. Now, Occidental astronomy uses zodiac signs and divides the ecliptic into 360 degrees. So when you're trying to incorporate foreign horoscopy into a Chinese astronomical context, you have two choices. You can either modify the Chinese system of astronomy, or you can modify the other system so that it fits the Chinese system, because there's a difference there in degree measurements. You either have 360 degrees or 365.25 degrees. So what I get when I looked at all of this material, I found that there was a figure named Cao Shiwei. Sometime around the year 800, he creates a calendar meant for astrology. And it became very common amongst astrologers to use this. And so there's this system of solar terms in Chinese in which the passage of the sun over the course of the year is divided into 24 separate periods. And they're also marked by the seasonal markers. So for example, you have the winter solstice, the vernal equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox. And this system you can easily divide into 360 days because it follows the passage of the sun, and it works well within Indian astronomy. Now, just to make things a bit clearer, I made this chart so you can actually see how it works in this way. So what they did was they took the first degree of Aries and they positioned it at the vernal equinox. And then you can use the Chinese lunar stations to position the planets. And over time, of course, every 71.6 years, you have to make a modification of 1 degree because you have the precession of the equinoxes, right? But they actually made a system where you can actually use the zodiac signs and convert it back and forth between the lunar stations relatively easily. Because if you know the first degree of the vernal equinox and the seasonal markers, and then you know where all of those seasonal markers are located in the sidereal lunar stations like this. So it actually makes a very easy system to convert between two different systems. So they were also very much aware of the technical difficulties in converting between the Western tradition and their own native Chinese tradition as well. And then they also had ephemerides for calculating the positions of the planets. So ephemerides are these tables which indicate the positions of the planets, so you don't have to do all the calculations yourself. If you're familiar with Greek astronomy and Arabic astrology, you know that they also had these tables. It makes calculating the positions of the planets much, much easier. But it's another interesting thing is that we also have evidence of Babylonian goal years in China, also from around this period in the 8th century. So Babylonian goal years are reoccurring planetary periodicities or cycles of movement from which predictions can be made. And they were discovered in ancient Mesopotamia. So they're most famously documented in Claudius Ptolemy's astronomy. And so you basically, if you know these numbers, then you don't have to go to great lengths to calculate the positions of the planets again and again and again, because you know that the cycle will repeat itself more or less identically. You might just have to make an adjustment again for axial precession. So as we know, the fixed stars move 1 degree every 71.6 years. But once you know this, then you can actually create the ephemerides in a much more efficient way, because you know that the positions of the planets will be more or less in the same place they were in the former cycle. But the Chinese astronomy didn't know about this, it seems, until it was introduced sometime in the 8th century. And again, because the numbers more or less line up with what's attested in the Mesopotamian and the Greek traditions, it seems clear to me that the Chinese received this knowledge, this technical knowledge, probably from a foreign source. So most likely from an Iranian source, or possibly even an Indian source. So when you compare the numbers, you can see that there's these parallels. So there's a lot of striking parallels here, even on the technical side of things. And so one of the key texts in the astrology tradition of Japan was this Duli-Yusu. And so I think the Chinese probably is a transcription of Dorotheus, probably from like an Iranian language, but that's not entirely clear. The actual title in Chinese doesn't mean anything. It's a phonetic transcription of something, and it probably means Dorotheus. So it's probably from Pahlavi, Middle Persian. Although it's not extant, there's fragments of this text in Chinese and Japanese sources. So we don't have the original text 100%, but we have citations of it in a great number of texts. And also there's a Daoist text in the Daoist canon, the scripture of the spiritual platform, and it uses a lot of Dorothean material, but it's slightly modified. So as a sinologist, as a scholar of Chinese text, you have to collate all of these different citations in these different sources and then put it together, and then you can see how the original text would have looked like, but we don't have the original 100% extant text. Now, what's interesting also in the Chinese tradition is that we have not 7 planets, and we don't have only 9 planets like the Indian system, but we have 11 planets. But this doesn't mean that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are part of this. They didn't have any knowledge of those. But rather, we have the visible planets, the sun, the moon, Rahu, and Ketu. And then we have these 2 planets, which in Chinese are called Ziqi and Yuebei. And you can see here in this one artist depiction, you can see Tejaprabha Buddha surrounded by the planets. And there's 11 planets. And what basically happens is you have this Indian system of 9 with the addition of Ziqi and Yuebei. Well, Ziqi is it's not a real planet in the sky, and it's not a fixed star. But like Rahu or Ketu, it is a point on the ecliptic that you can track over time, and you can use it as a planet. So, for example, Rahu is the ascending node of the moon. You cannot see the ascending node of the moon, but mathematically you can calculate its position over time. And then in astrology, you can use that as a planet. And Ziqi is also used, but it's used actually as an arbitrary point, which you use to calculate intercalary months over time. So you just do division, and then you can calculate where it's supposed to be on the ecliptic. And then you can calculate when you're supposed to insert an intercalary month. But what's more interesting is Yuebei, because Yuebei is, first of all, Yuebei is a deity because she's also depicted like the other planets as well. And she's a malefic feminine figure. You could maybe say she's a demoness. And in one of these Daoist texts, The Secret Practice of the Primordial Lord Yue Bei, it says that surnamed Jewel Vermilion with the honorific title of Guang, luminous, in the form of a celestial human. Their hair is let down over their naked body. Their mass of black hair covers the navel. Red sandals. Their left hand holds the head of a drought demon. Their right hand holds a blade. They ride a jade dragon. In their modified form, they display a blue face with long fangs, a crimson garment and blade while driving a bear. That's a lot of esoteric lore, but the point here is that this Yue Bei is also a god or a goddess, and there's also depictions here. So you can see that her shoulders are bare, and she has a decapitated head, and she has this sort of wrathful figure. But then what is Yue Bei? And as a planet in astrology, what exactly is it? Well, it's the lunar apogee. We actually have a definition in a Chinese astronomical text. So Liu Dingzhi, he defines it as produced from the moon. There are constants for the velocity of the moon's movement. The slowest point is the Bei, which is why it is called the lunar Bei. The Bei has 7 rotations in a 62-year period. So 62 divided by 7, 8.85 years. That's the lunar apsidal precession. So it's the lunar apogee. And that makes sense because the lunar apogee, like the ascending node of the moon or the descending node of the moon, is a point that you can track astronomically over time. Now, what's interesting is in the Hellenistic tradition, in the Latin tradition, Arabic tradition, Indian tradition, everybody knew what the lunar apogee was. They could track it, they could calculate its position, but they did not treat it as a planet. I recently spoke to Professor Alexander Jones at NYU University in New York, and I asked him about this problem. And he said that in some of the Greek horoscopes, there is mention of the lunar apogee, but it's only like an astronomical calculation. So it's like they note the position of the lunar apogee, but they're not actually explaining what it means. So other traditions of astrology do have the lunar apogee as something they use in like a mathematical or an astronomical context, but they don't treat it as a planet. But in the Chinese tradition, they do, or they did. Where that comes from is a big question, because all of this was supposed to have been imported from foreign countries, probably from Iran and India, but the extant traditions of Persian, Islamic, and Indian astrology don't have the lunar apogee as a planet. So it's one of these mysteries of the history of astrology where this idea of the planet came from. I don't think it was invented in China, because the Chinese themselves at the time said it came from foreign country. But for them, they don't give much history on it. They just say kind of the nebulous Western countries, that's where it came from. And that's all they can say. Now, before we delve into some of the technical doctrines, we'll also just briefly overview the evidence we have of actual horoscopes in China. So there's a document in China that was discovered at Dunhuang, which is it's a city in northwest China, and there was a collection of texts hidden in a cave around the year 1000. And in the early 20th century, they opened up this cave and they found all these wonderful texts in it. And one of them is actually a horoscope. And it's consists of handwritten notes for a natal horoscope for somebody born in the year 930. And it was produced in 975. So it gives us a date. When was the person born and when was the horoscope being written? It doesn't give the original table. It only gives the notation, like the positions of the planets, and then like an interpretation. It's about 7 or 8 pages. And then I recreated the table of it using this sort of thing. And it gives us a lot of information, and it tells us how an astrologer at the time understood astrology and the sort of doctrines that they used. And a lot of these would be familiar to anybody who's familiar with Hellenistic astrology, for example. And we'll talk about some of that shortly. And there was also horoscopy in Japan. So from the late 10th century, there was a lineage of astrologer monks, the Sukuyōdō. So literally, that means like the way of the lunar mansions and the planets. And it lasted until the 14th century. And then there's this one medieval depiction of this astrologer monk. So he's sitting down and you can see in front of him a text, and there's 2 circles. And he's an astrologer monk, so he's actually looking at horoscopes. So some artists were unfamiliar with this and they didn't really know what he was looking at. Like they were wondering what these circles were. Probably the artist who depicted this didn't really know what those were either, but because he's an astrologer monk, he's looking at horoscopes. And we have two extant horoscopes from medieval Japan. One of them is from the 12th century, and this one also includes the original table. This is like a 19th century typeset, like a printed edition of the original text. This would have been in a handwritten form originally, but then this is a scholarly typeset edition from the 19th century, which we can look at, but it has the original table as well. And it gives us like not just the table, but it also gives us the astrologer's interpretation of everything. And then he also explains things like what the client can expect in the future, and the sort of problems he's facing today. And similarly, there's another horoscope from the 13th century, which includes also the original table. And this is the original handwritten table of the original document. So for scholars, it's very valuable to have these because we can actually see how astrology was practiced at like a very technical level as well, not just in like a general historical sense, but like exactly how were they reading the horoscope, how did they position the planets and so forth. And being able to look at the original handwritten notes like this is also very interesting because sometimes you will see things like notes in the margin and so forth that can be very, very telling. So before we go into the techniques, maybe we should have a quick break. Yeah.
Okay, so if there are any questions, I think it's a good time to do them.
Sure. Yeah. Any questions? Please.
I was wondering if you could shed some light on the nature of fate and causality in Eastern tradition. When you mentioned that you introduced electional astrology, essentially there was some type of evidence that fate was not purely deterministic, which is something that I disagree with. So I was wondering if you could share some.
Well, for example, with electional astrology, it proposes that the outcome of an action will change depending on when you carry out the action.
Right.
So whether you do it on Saturday or Sunday, or whether Mars is at the ascendant or not, will determine the outcome of your action. So that means that fate is not 100% determined.
I mean, I understand my premise of it.
Yeah.
I think that that actually tells something about the fundamental
Okay.
apparatus of reality.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Well, it's a very complex question. So in the original Buddhist tradition, they have this idea of karma,
Right.
which is that your past life karma determines your circumstances in the present life, and your present actions will determine what happens in the present life and in all future lives. And then when you introduce astrology into that, it becomes very complex. And I think in the Buddhist tradition, they viewed the planets as gods and goddesses that are kind of interfering with your life, just as demons could also interact with your life and cause problems for you as well. And then in the original Chinese tradition, they had a very well-developed conception of destiny and fate. And their conception was a concept called Qian, which is often translated as heaven. And generally, they viewed it as sort of like a divine intelligence that governs the cosmos and the world. And this also was part of the imperial apparatus as well. So the emperor had the mandate of heaven. And if he didn't behave virtuously and if he failed at his duties, then heaven would give the mandate of heaven to another family. And then you would have another emperor take over the country. So there was a sort of divinity and intelligence also connected to this concept of fate. And so it's a very complex question because the concept of destiny or fate meant different things to different people. Yeah.
So for instance, if we look at, I don't know, Chris Bryan in his book of
Right.
Hellenistic astrology, he mentioned that when we look at the Mesopotamian,
Right.
we see some mentions of like understanding astrology is like omens, right?
Right.
So, there was this level of awareness that it may not, so the celestial bodies may not be actually interfering with life, but some sort of
Right. There's
directing
right.
their own,
Right. There's like one way in astrology you could look at it where the planets signal represent fate, but they don't directly interact with us.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then when you look at the idea of the planets as gods and goddesses, particularly in Indian and then later Chinese traditions, they're clearly seen as divinities which interact with the world, and you can interact with them as well. And that's why there's rituals, like magical rituals you can do in order to appease them or to placate them. And so if the planets only represented fate, then there wouldn't be a need for a magical tradition where you make offerings to the planets and you ask them, please make sure that this period in my life is goes well and that there's no problems. So there's different ways to look at it. I would say that in East Asia, they viewed the planets as gods and goddesses which interact with your life, and then you can predict how they're going to interact with your life based on astrology. Yeah.
So you say that was being like a more literal relationship of sort of being ruled by the winds of God.
Right. Yes. There's a literal interaction there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the relation between the zodiac that came from the West and the zodiac we often hear. We were speaking about the Chinese zodiac, the rat and the ox, and the monkey, sort of what.
That-
Is an older Chinese?
No, I think it's mostly modern, actually. And when you say the Chinese zodiac, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not actually what the Chinese themselves call it.
Mhm.
It's because it's called the Chinese zodiac because there's 12 of them. And there's this assumption that it's comparable to the zodiac, like a tropical zodiac, but it's really not. And the way that it works is that each year is ruled over by one of the animals, but that's connected to the Chinese calendar, and it's not connected to like the vernal equinox. So this concept of the Chinese, this concept of the Chinese zodiac is not connected to like the tropical zodiac or the sidereal zodiac. It's connected to the Chinese calendar, and it's a popular conception. And I haven't been able to trace it to like the medieval period. Like I don't see them in the medieval period saying it's like, I belong to the year of the rat, therefore there's these sort of qualities I'm likely to have. So like often I get asked the question about Chinese astrology, and there's modern Chinese astrology, but that's a separate tradition from what existed in the medieval period. And it's the same thing in Japan. There's people who say that I practice the same tradition that they had in medieval Japan. But when you actually look at historically what they were doing at the time, it's very different from what's done in the modern period. Maybe it's comparable to like 20th century astrology and like Hellenistic astrology as well. There's a division there.
And when you mentioned for imperial purposes or for historical purposes that they refer to, I don't know, periods in some relation to the sky, doesn't that have to do with this division that they, of the 12? Yeah, I can't remember what they call them, these 12 animals.
The 12 animals. But that's more for like marking the calendar.
Yeah.
So that's more for timekeeping. There is an astrological component to that, but that's not necessarily so much tied to individual fate,
Absolutely.
right? So like you can say it's the year of the rat,
Mhm.
but you can use that only for timekeeping purposes. But in China in the medieval period, there was they have like a system of timekeeping which uses like 12 earthly branches, for example, and each of those is associated with an animal. But at the time, they didn't like necessarily constantly evoke the animal that's associated with it in the way that's done today. So it was more used for calendrical timekeeping purposes. So, yeah.
If I may ask one quick
Please.
different question, is there a translation of Dorotheus? As Dorotheus,
The Chinese?
or the other?
Yes, yes. So yeah, there's two of them. There's David Pingree's translation, which was published, I think, in the 1970s, and then also there's the recent one. Yeah, Benjamin Dykes. Benjamin Dykes also translated it again from the Arabic. Yeah.
We got still regarding the signs. What I've seen is the Jesuits when they're translating the zodiacal signs, they use the animals.
Yeah.
By that time, so probably.
But that's 17th century.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So probably that's where
Right,
Might be done when things start crossing.
right,
Be prepared.
right. That's correct.
Well, we have a question here also, by the last one. One astronomical concept is identical to.
What's the chi? Intercalary months. So if you in a lot of ancient calendars, like the Chinese calendar, for example, they have normally 12 months per year, but what ends up happening is you have a surplus, or you have extra days. So every 2.5, 2.7 years or something, you have to add a 13th month to the year. And so the chi is connected with that. And it's a point on the ecliptic that moves over time. And then when it's moved so many degrees, you know that you're supposed to insert an intercalary month. I know it's very innovative and original, but that's what it was used for. I haven't quite figured out where that comes from either. So, any other questions?
Good question. When you said the sidereal lunar mansion.
Yes.
And that was different from the Indians, because the Indians use the tropical ones?
No, the Indians also used a sidereal lunar mansion system. It's just that the actual divisions, or the actual sizes, the size of each of them is very, very different. But because the Chinese had 28 lunar stations or mansions, and the Indian system also had 28, they just basically used the Chinese system as a substitute. So they just, when they translate, for example, Ashvini or Kotyk, Indian lunar mansions, they just use the Chinese system as comparable, even though in practice they were not the same. And at the time they knew they were not the same, but they just figured like, well, they're more or less the same, so we'll just use them as is. So you end up with this system of like functional equivalents or substitutions being used in this way. Okay, so many of the common doctrines of Hellenistic astrology are found in Chinese sources starting from around the year 800. And we're going to discuss some of these techniques and discuss also maybe how they differ from what we would be familiar with from Hellenistic astrology, because over time there was also some local concept. You know, wood, fire, earth, water, metal. And that's different from the four elements of Greek philosophy. But a lot of what we see in East Asia in the medieval period is very much comparable to what good to go. Right. And then the eighth house is not explicitly death, but rather that of illness and so forth and so forth. In this case, when the 12 places are discussed, it's discussing primarily fortune and things, either good things that will come or bad things that will come. So when it's talking about, for example, the brothers, it's not talking about, for example, how many brothers you will have, but rather whether your brothers or your siblings will offer any sort of fortune to you or misfortune. Although these sort of labels are only the first step, because the house divisions can also signify other things that are not explicitly related to the names of each of them. So for example, if we're looking at An example chart, again, I'm just translating what the Chinese text says. So Jupiter transiting the first place turns the weak strong and the strong weak. So we look at, if Jupiter is transiting through the first house, it has this sort of signification. When Mars transits the 8th place, there will be illness and one's wife will bring about slanders. There will be loss of wealth, disease, and destruction. So this should be familiar. So Mars is a malefic and tends to signify or bring about things related to injury and loss, conflict, that sort of thing. Saturn transits the 2nd place. So the 2nd place is associated with wealth. There will be loss of wealth, disease most painful, and slander without truth to it. So again, the characteristics of a malefic. When Venus transits the 9th place, there will be disease and loss of oxen and horses. So in some cases too, the benefics also can signal negative things. The sort of characteristics of each of the planets, it's when we say like they're a benefic, they're not necessarily exclusively always indicating good things. And in the Chinese tradition in particular, the benefics mostly signal good things, but they can also signal negative developments as well. So it's not entirely so binary or black and white between the benefics and the malefics. So this is just one example of the 12 houses being one of the most familiar astrological doctrines. Another doctrine which was very important in Chinese astrology was that of the lots. This is nowadays also called the Arabic parts. And these are different formulas there's different formulas for calculating the specific lots. So in principle, one measures the distance between two positions in the chart, and then you release it from that same distance from the ascendant. So, for example, the lot of spirit would be from the moon to the sun. So as you can see in this chart, you measure the distance between the moon and the sun. And in this configuration, it's about 3 signs. So then you release that from the ascendant, that same ascendant. So the 3rd house becomes the lot of spirit. And there's a position there, the lot of spirit. And usually the positions are reversed based on whether the chart is diurnal or nocturnal. So if the chart is a daytime chart, then you use this formula. And then if it's a nighttime chart, then you reverse it. So it's a relatively simple way of creating these positions on the chart that have specific significations. And when we look at the list of lots that's given in one of the Daoist texts, it's actually very similar to what's given in Dorotheus of Sidon. So here I'm using Benjamin Dyke's translation. And so on the left-hand side, you have the Chinese lots and the formula, if it's a daytime chart, and then what's given in Dorotheus. And most of the time, they tend to be identical, although not always so. So you can see, for example, the lot of fortune, sun to moon, sun to moon. But then there's also at least one lot here, for example, the lot of longevity is given in the Chinese, but it's not found in the Arabic translation of Dorotheus of Sidon. Also, this lot of illness. Generally, though, they're basically identical, which gives us more evidence to suggest that the system of lots that you find in Chinese was probably based on the work of Dorotheus of Sidon. But you can see that the lots deal with any number of different topics, such as fortune, wealth, disease, wives, and we're going to discuss some of these. And it was a very influential doctrine. So how does this work? So the lot of spirit is said to signify one's religious or spiritual proclivities in the Chinese system. So again, if it's a daytime chart, you measure from the sun to the moon. So what exactly would it mean to have planets in the lot of spirit? Well, in the Chinese system, your interest in religious things or certain philosophy or maybe even some sort of habit can be determined by the planets that occupy the lot of spirit. And you can see here that they took what was originally a Hellenistic concept and they adapted it to China. So if the sun is in the lot of spirit, then you'll probably be interested in Taoism. If it's Jupiter, alchemy, moon, Buddhism, Mars, many rites, Saturn, longevity practices, Venus, phylogeny, so the love of women, and Mercury, literature, and Mars is repeated again for martial valor. So you'll be interested in martial arts. But this is really significant because obviously in Hellenistic astrology, they wouldn't have referred to Taoism because Taoism is an indigenous Chinese religion. But when they were adapting astrology into a Chinese context, they had to assign religions that were familiar to people. So you wouldn't say like the sun is associated with, for example, Christianity, because there was very, very few Christians in China at the time. But you would want to, when you're reading a horoscope of a Chinese person at the time, you could say, well, you'll be interested in Taoism or Buddhism. And there's actually there's actually a connection between this and the associations with religions in the medieval Arabic tradition. So there's texts like Gayat al-Hakim, which is the original Arabic text from which the Picatrix was translated. And the planets are associated with different religions traditionally. So, for example, Christianity is a solar religion. Judaism is a Saturn religion. I think Islam is associated with Venus. The moon is associated with idol worship. So when I see here that the moon is associated with Buddhism, I wonder if originally the material wasn't referring to like the worship of icons and statues, because Buddhism, especially Buddhism in China, has a lot of statues and icons and worship of images and icons and that sort of thing. But what's interesting here too is you also have some familiar astrological lore evident when it says that Saturn is associated with longevity practices. Well, longevity practices would be meditation and medical practices that you would use to extend your life. And so that this was something of almost a philosophy in itself in China. But it makes sense to associate that with Saturn because Saturn is connected with long life and longevity and old men. And so that's why they associated this with Saturn, and Mars with martial valor. And that's not a Chinese concept, because actually in the very, very ancient Chinese lore, Venus was actually more associated with war because Venus is the metal star. So therefore, Venus would actually be associated with soldiers. Mars was the fiery star, but he wasn't associated with soldiers, strictly speaking, in the original Chinese model. But then when you have the introduction of foreign astrology, Mars is associated with soldiers and war and martial arts and that sort of thing. So you can see here that there's an adaptation, but they're also faithfully retaining some of these original Hellenistic concepts. There's also the law of fortune, which is very prominent also in Western astrology. So you measure the sun to the moon. But unlike Ptolemy, the law of fortune is reversed here. So Claudius Ptolemy, famously, he doesn't reverse the law of fortune. So whether it's a daytime chart or a nighttime chart, the formula is the same. Whereas in this case, you reverse it. So that tells us that this system here probably is not connected to Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. It's separate from that. And it comes from a different tradition. So in the Chinese tradition, if the law of fortune falls in a favorable house, you have good fortune. If it's in a weak house, then the fortune is limited. So a strong house or a weak house, that could be, for example, an angular house versus a cadent house. So the first house would be a excellent house, a good house, whereas the third or the sixth, for example, wouldn't be so as favorable. Also, you have to look at if it's a diurnal birth. The nocturnal triplicity rulers are all weekend. So I'll also talk about that briefly in a bit. The position of wealth. So you measure from the ruler of the second house, the house of wealth, to the house of wealth itself, and you examine whether the lot is high or low. And so again, angular versus cadent. You look at the aspects and the ruler itself. And the ruler of the house determines where the wealth will be acquired. So you want to see who is ruling the house. So if it's, for example, the lot of wealth falls on Scorpio, that means that Mars is ruling the lot of wealth. And the planetary rulers will indicate where the person is likely to acquire their wealth from. So the sun, inheritance from past generations of one's own family. The moon, inheritance from the wife's family. So the moon is associated with women, the feminine, and the mother side of the family. Jupiter, you'll receive it from your office or your job. Mars, the spoils of war. Saturn, from servants or underlings. Agriculture, that's a very Saturnine theme, both agriculture, but also being a beneficiary of somebody else as well. So employing other people or acquiring wealth from the labor of others. Mercury through writing. That's also should bring to mind something like Hermes the scribe. So Mercury is associated with writing, and Venus through one's wife. And so that's so your wife will produce the wealth, and then you'll be a beneficiary of this. So this is also this sort of system too is assuming that the readers and the practitioners are primarily men. There's no evidence I've seen so far that suggests that in China that there were any women astrologers. That's not to say that there weren't. It's just that I haven't found any text which is writing from a explicitly female position. And it generally, when it's talking to the men, it's talking about, for example, your wife, your spouse, that sort of thing. And it doesn't really speak so much to women's concerns. It's primarily oriented around the interests of men, as is often the case in the history of astrology. So if a benefic is present in the lot, then the acquisition will occur. But if a malefic is there, it will destroy it. So in this case, even if you do have a planet that indicates some sort of acquisition of wealth, you have to look at whether a benefic is there or a malefic, in which case then that wealth, the acquisition of it will be disrupted or destroyed. And also in this case too, it starts to introduce some of the information regarding the head and tail, the nodes, the north node and the south node. And so if the north node or the south node are there, then you'll lose it in circumstances of war. Now there's also the lot of longevity, and you measure it from Jupiter to the moon, reverse it if nocturnal. And long life is indicated if a benefic is present in the lot, but a premature demise is signified by a malefic. If the moon and Jupiter together signify longevity, but not so if Jupiter is retrograde. So these are some of the conditions that you have to look at. So again, if a benefic is there, then it likely indicates that you're going to enjoy longer life, but if you have a malefic, then that's less likely. So it's attempting to actually predict a person's death effectively through looking at this lot. But if Jupiter is retrograde, then that would not be favorable for the native, for the client, the person whose horoscope is represented. There's also the lot of death and captivity. The Chinese literally means death and captivity. And so it's actually signaling both here. And this primarily signifies the type of death or this type of demise. So interestingly, it says that the Sun, Moon, Jupiter, and Mercury indicate favorable deaths. Presumably that means, dying from natural causes at an advanced age, whereas the nodes and Mars indicate unfortunate deaths. And then it also goes into talking about the specific type of death. So Venus, death due to a woman. It doesn't really go into any other detail than that. It just suggests that Venus in the lot of death and captivity would represent your death being somehow associated with a woman. Death due to the Tao, religious practice. In a Chinese context, what this really means is not meditation, but probably sort of some practice of alchemy. Because in Chinese Taoism, they have a practice of what they call inner alchemy, where they ingest, they actually swallow mercury and other toxic compounds like cinnabar and that sort of thing in an attempt to either extend their lives, cure disease, or to achieve immortality. And it was very, very common in antiquity for people to practice this sort of thing over the course of a number of years, like ingesting mercury, actually swallowing mercury. And people, of course, were known to die from this, but it was a sort of philosophy and a practice in itself. So Jupiter, death as an officer or a gentleman. Mercury, death due to a cold illness. Saturn, death to a stomach illness. Mars, a bloody death. And nodes, a death due to fright. So in here we can also see a sort of indication of medical astrology as well, because it's suggesting that Mercury is associated with cold illnesses where you lose body heat, and Saturn is associated with a stomach illness. So it's assuming that there's some sort of connection between the planets and specific diseases. And so this tells me also that there was a practice of medical astrology amongst the Chinese astrologers at the time. I wrote a paper actually for Asian medicine some years ago about this topic, that astrological medicine was actually practiced in China starting from around the year 800. And I propose that if we look at the astrological text, we can see that the astrologers were attempting to diagnose and identify diseases based on horoscopes. And then when I sent it in for peer review, one of the reviewers was very, very negative. And they said, look, if you look at the history of Chinese medicine, there's no astrology. This isn't part of any of the mainstream texts. This is not Chinese medicine. This is something else. And they actually rejected my paper. One of the peer reviewers rejected my paper. And then I replied to this criticism and I said, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that astrological medicine was part of mainstream Chinese medicine. I'm saying that Chinese astrologers attempted to practice a form of medicine, which we call astrological medicine. And it was separate from mainstream Chinese medicine, but we can't deny that it existed. And clearly some people believed in this. It's just different from the European model where astrological magic was part of natural science and the practice of mainstream medicine. In the Chinese context, it was the astrologers who were doing this, not the physicians. But that doesn't mean that these two traditions couldn't exist side by side. Probably astrological medicine in China was more of like a minority of astrologers who were actively practicing it, but it still existed. And the textual tradition suggests that this was in fact practiced at the time. Another lot is the lot of calamity. So from the moon to the 8th house, Mars and Saturn, the malefics, indicate disaster. But if Mars or Saturn is the domicile ruler, there will be no disaster, whereas the nodes signify disaster. And then you also have to look at the annual perfection. So if the annual perfection falls on the slot, it's also significant. I'll talk about that shortly. And if the lot is also measured separately for the year of the upcoming annual perfection, and its significations last for that year. So the lot of the natal chart is for the whole lifetime. So what does that mean exactly? You have to look at the annual perfections. So as we know, the annual perfections work from it starts from the first house. So that's your ascendant ruler. So you look at the zodiac sign who's ruling over your first sign, the first sign from your ascendant. So in this case, if we look at the horoscope from the 10th century, the ascendant ruler is Scorpio. So the first year is governed by Mars. The second year will be governed by Jupiter because Sagittarius, and so forth and so forth. And so each one of those years is ruled by the planet who rules over the domicile in this system. So annual perfections are attested in Chinese, and you can actually also look at the lots looking at each solar return. So you go from one perfection to another perfection when the sun returns to the same position it was at when you were born. And so that's your solar return. And when the solar return happens, you can actually cast a new chart, and then you can also calculate the lots, and then you look at what will happen over the course of the next 12 months. And so that's what this is talking about, that you can actually cast the lots also at the annual perfection. So you want to see where the lot of fortune is, the lot of disaster, and that indicates things that will happen over the next 12 months. And then if you cast the lots for the birth chart, so at the time of birth, then that represents the entire lifetime. So you can look at the lots from the solar return, or you can look at the lots also from the nativity itself. There's also the lot of illness, and this also associates the planets with specific illnesses in more detail. So the sun and the moon, diseases of the eyes, Jupiter, wind diseases, so respiratory diseases, Mars, sores and bruises, Saturn, pain due to swelling, Mercury, cold diseases, Venus, coughing diseases, nodes, internal diseases. Again, this is an example where you can look at the lot for the whole nativity, or you can measure it from the annual perfection and look at it for a single year. And that's how you can do this sort of prognostication regarding diseases. And so my sense is when we look at the texts is that Chinese astrologers were attempting to diagnose illnesses based on astrology at the time. This isn't really recognized in the history of Chinese medicine, which is why I published a paper on the topic. And I'm not sure it will necessarily be affirmed long term, but at least I have demonstrated that Chinese astrologers were practicing some form of medicine at the time. And then there's also the lot of brothers. And so in this case, you're looking at whether you're going to have many brothers or few brothers. And you also, interestingly, you can also have references here that the brothers will be of different races, which also stems from what you see in Dorotheus of Sidon, where he talks about some of the lots, how you can see whether your siblings will come from the same ethnic background. That's the sort of thing that's sort of being alluded to here. The lot of wives and concubines. So this is kind of this would be related to marriage. And when I say wives and concubines, it's literally what the Chinese means, because it's not coming from a monogamous society. Chinese society historically was polygamous. And so you would have had a principal wife, a second wife, at least if you were aristocratic, and then there was the practice of concubines as well. So and this would have been, you know, known also to other cultures too, in India and Persia and so forth. And so it's also discussing whether they're going to be a beneficiary to you, whether they'll benefit you. A malefic overtaking the lot indicates infidelity or malicious gossip or a broken household. So it's also attempting to predict internal family dynamics as well. And then interestingly, if a planet is in this lot, it can signify different circumstances. So who will be most influential when it comes to your marriage arrangement? So Mars, it indicates a courtesan. Jupiter having 2 wives, and you will acquire the wealth of the ladies, probably through marriage. The sun and the moon, you'll get a good wife. Saturn, a difficult marriage, and the couple will not be the same age. So a difference in age. Mercury will get a good wife who comprehends letters and music. And then the nodes, the wife will be evil. So here the nodes are associated with generally malefic themes as well. Generally in Chinese astrology, the astrological texts, the nodes, which are normally called Rahu and Ketu after the Indian tradition, they're generally regarded as malefic. They don't really have positive attributes. In some cases they can, but generally they're treated as negative. And then it also provides, in some cases, alternate formula. So you can also count from the sun to the moon and then apply the distance from Venus. The lot of children. So you measure from Jupiter to Saturn. Benefics in this lot indicate that good children will be born for certain, but malefics indicate harm. So harm to the children. The number of planets between the ascendant to the sign in which the lot falls indicates the number of children. If the first planet seen is yin, so feminine, then the firstborn is a daughter, whereas if it's yang, then it is a son. And so benefics indicate a virtuous son, a malefic, a wicked child. So, for example, what you do is you look at the number of planets between the ascendant and where the lot falls. And so, for example, if the first planet you see is Mars, then it indicates that will be a son, but probably a bad son. And so it's attempting to predict the number of children and whether they'll be good children or bad children in the long term. So it becomes like this sort of interpretation, it becomes very detailed and complex, and they're actually trying to make very specific predictions. And there will also be harm if this planet is under the rays or if it's retrograde. So it's also discussing the condition of the planets. So if a planet is retrograde, that's generally not a good indication. It's a negative indication. And if it's under the rays of the sun, which in modern astrology we would also call combust, because it's under the degrees of the sun, then it's also not in a good condition. And then you also have to determine the power of the children based on the sect of the planets. So as we know, the planets either favor the daytime or the nighttime. So planets, for example, Saturn, as the malefic, he prefers daytime. Mars prefers nighttime. There's the sun, the moon, daytime, nighttime. And so you also have to look at that factor as well. There's a lot of the mother. So harm to the mother is indicated if Mars aspects the moon in a nocturnal birth,
or if Saturn aspects the moon in a nocturnal birth, if the moon is in a sign below the earth. So also the point to emphasize here is that sect, the daytime or the nighttime qualities of the planets is very important. And that's something that you also see in the work of Dorotheus of Sidon consistently, is the emphasis on sect. Sect isn't necessarily as important when you get to the medieval European and Arabic traditions, whereas it's much more prominent in the Hellenistic tradition from what I've seen. Now, interestingly, the Chinese here says that if the sun and the moon are in tropical signs, and also a tropical sign is positioned to the east, then the person's parents will be of different types or races. And this was interesting when I read this, because I saw there was a direct parallel in Dorotheus. And Dorotheus says, if you find the sun and the moon in tropical signs and the ascendant in a tropical sign, then the parents of this native are not from one race. So there is like parallels here between Dorotheus. Sometimes it's actually quite explicit. So you can see that the Chinese is based on the work of Dorotheus. Just unfortunately, we just don't have either the Greek or the later Persian translation of Dorotheus. We just have the extant Arabic. And unfortunately, I don't read Arabic myself, so I have to rely on the translation by David Pingree and also Benjamin Dykes. The lot of the mother. So if elevated, it signifies that the father is strong, whereas the moon as triplicity ruler signifies that the mother is strong. Venus and the moon are in a sign below the earth. The mother will be impoverished, and there will be malicious gossip. So it's also talking about the parents of the native. Moving on, this is actually probably one of the most, this is the last lot I'll talk about. It's the most significant one for a very important reason. It's the lot of Eros, the lot of love. And so you measure it from the 12th house to the lot of spirit. It says here that if the lot falls on Taurus, Aries, Pisces, or Capricorn, there will be much love. And if Venus is present, then it will be especially so. But it goes into further detail here, and it's actually the only example in Chinese astrology where actual sexuality is discussed. It says if Mercury is in Aries or Capricorn, and if Mars is in, that part of the text is corrupted, so missing, then like mandarin ducks in a flowering tree, the native will like male charm. So that's a reference to homosexuality, male love. And this is the only example in Chinese astrology that I've seen where this is explicitly spelled out. But this is also interesting because it also is proposing that sexuality can be predetermined based on astrological factors, which also it's basically suggesting that sexuality has a sort of predetermined quality to it. And in the history of Chinese literature, this is a very interesting example where this is explicitly stated. Now, if you read Dorotheus of Sidon, Dorotheus of Sidon also makes predictions about whether you'll favor, a gay or a lesbian or a bisexual lifestyle as well. So for the Greek tradition, it wasn't really so alien, but when this was translated into Chinese, they also attempted to discuss sexuality. And it also says, like, if Venus and the moon are in the 4th and the lot falls here, then the native will have sex with men and women. If Venus is stationary, they will have exchanges with numerous people. So it's also talking about bisexuality or, polyamory, as we would call it today. So having, partnerships with multiple people. And then if Mars and Venus are together, they will be sexually dissatisfied. Venus in the 8th or Mars in the 9th signifies preference for both men and women. So it's quite explicit where it's talking about polyamory, bisexuality, and homosexuality. And in the history of Chinese religion and Chinese philosophy, this is a unique example where this is explicitly spelled out. Any questions so far? Good. Okay, moving on. One of the concepts in Chinese astrology that's very important is called the body sign. That's literally how we translate it. And it's the position where the moon is located. And there was actually originally a connection between the moon and the body in ancient Egypt. Dorian Greenbaum, the Daimon in Hellenistic Astrology, which is a great book, she mentions this, that the body is associated with the moon, whereas the soul and the spirit is associated with the sun. And so here the text is saying, you first determine the sign in which the moon is positioned, for this is considered the body sign. So things associated with your physical form are indicated where the moon is positioned. And planets in the body sign exert an influence over the native. So this in practice refers to a conjunction with the moon in a whole sign configuration. So in Chinese and Japanese astrology, historically, they use whole sign configurations in the medieval period. This is a big discussion now of like whether you use whole signs or use other house divisions in modern astrology. But in the medieval period, I've only ever seen basically whole sign configurations. And it was just used consistently until maybe the 17th century when the Jesuits introduced Ptolemaic astrology, but that comes much, much later. So how does this work? So the body sign, you look if there's any planets there in the sign in which the moon is positioned. So the sun and the moon are present. They will be greatly honored and have money. They will have long life. So it would basically be like a conjunction between the moon and these planets. If Mars is present, the mother is inhibited. So Mars would indicate harm to the mother. If Saturn is present, they will be much impeded in their affairs. They should cultivate the way of spirituality. Now, when it says, the Chinese like literally says cultivate the way, what that probably means is some sort of monastic lifestyle. Because when you say cultivate the way in Chinese, in a Daoist context, it means probably being something like a hermit who's dedicated to alchemy and meditation and philosophy. And in a Buddhist context, that would mean becoming a Buddhist monk or a nun, which entails celibacy. So this should also bring to mind the European tradition where Saturn is associated with Jesuits, with priests, with monastic lifestyles and that sort of thing. So in the Chinese context, it's very similar as well. If Venus is present, they will delight in appearances, have many desires, and gain the admiration of women. So they'll be good looking, and then they'll also be very attractive and have many desires. Now, if Mercury is present, they will delight in letters, and they will be sharp in mind and possess wisdom. So these sort of mercurial characteristics will be present in the native. And then there's also the life sign, which greatly governs fate. So you look at the sign or the lunar mansion in which the sun is positioned, and this is considered the life sign. So the moon, the body sign, the sun, the life sign. And this also has a lot of significations. So in determining a person's fortunes, first place the body and life signs, and then the triplicity rulers. If the triplicity rulers of the body and life signs are not empowered, or if only the triplicity rulers reside in good places, then the native will gain middle to lower eminence. If the triplicity rulers are all unempowered, whereas the body and life rulers are in good places, they will gain little fortune and little eminence. So in this case, it's not so much the domicile rulers that are important, but rather it's the triplicity rulers. Now, what are the triplicity rulers? We're going to unpack this. What exactly are we talking about here? And it's the traditional system of the triplicity rulers, which is very prominent in the work of Dorotheus of Sidon, where you have the zodiac signs forming 4 separate angles relative to one another. And you have the diurnal rulers and the nocturnal rulers. And then these sets are also divided into what in Chinese are called yang signs and yin signs. So yin and yang. And so this represents the diurnal and the nocturnal. And so you have to look at whether the triplicity rulers are in their favored, if they're in their favored time of day and their favorite sect or not. And so if the triplicity rulers are in a good condition, then the native will enjoy better fortune. So you have to look at all of these different factors when looking at the life sign. So this should be familiar to anybody who's looked at Hellenistic astrology. This is how the system of the triplicity rulers works. And it was more or less, it was basically identically reproduced in the Chinese tradition from the translation of the material from abroad. It should be familiar. Now, in one of the Daoist texts that explains astrology, it says, for those born in the daytime, look to the sign in which the sun is located to determine it. Whereas for those born at night, look to the sign in which the moon is located to determine it, and the rulers will be had. So this is the triplicity ruler of the chart. So you have to, or the triplicity ruler of the chart as a whole. And so if it's daytime chart, you look where the sun is. If it's a nighttime chart, you look to where the moon is. And then you have to, those will be the triplicity rulers of the chart. So just as an example, so if you see on the left side here, the sun is above the ascendant. So that means it's a daytime chart. So if the sun is above the horizon, it's a daytime chart. So you look to the position of the sun. So it's in Pisces. So you look at the rulers, Venus, Mars, Moon. So these will be the triplicity rulers. These will have a particular impact over fate. And you want to look at the condition of these planets, especially the first one. So in this case, Venus. And if the sun is below the horizon, then that means you have to look to the position, you have to look to the moon, and the moon's triplicity rulers will govern the chart as a whole. And so Cancer in this case is housing the moon, so you look and you see it's Mars, Venus, Moon. So it works like this, the triplicity rulers. And this sort of doctrine was very important in determining the fate and fortunes. So it says here, if a diurnal birth and the sun is in a yang sign, or if in a nocturnal birth and the moon is in a yin sign, then this is not contrary to the triplicity rulers, and they will all be people who gain power and great prosperity. So you have to look at whether the triplicity rulers are happy being in the daytime or the nighttime. And this will have a great effect on whether they are going to be enjoying wealth or not. But on the contrary, it can also indicate bad fortune. So if a diurnal birth and the sun is in a yin sign, or if in a nocturnal birth and the moon is in a yang sign, these are contrary to the triplicity rulers, and the native will be destitute throughout life. So again, if the triplicity rulers are not in a good state, then they will indicate bad fortune. So this is a more clear example. So here we look at the sun in Pisces. So it's a diurnal birth. So is Venus, Mars, and Moon. So Venus, Mars, and Moon prefer the nighttime. And these are the triplicity rulers for the native. But in this instance, they are contrary to the favored sect, because it's a daytime chart. So in a daytime chart, especially Mars is unhappy, because Mars prefers the nighttime. Mars prefers nighttime because it's cool and he's hot. And conversely, Saturn prefers the daytime because he's cold. I mean, that's the traditional explanation. So that's how this sort of sect works. And this is carried over very, very clearly from the Hellenistic tradition. Whereas in this case, you would look to the moon and you would see that Mars, Venus, and the moon, being the triplicity rulers, prefer night. And in this case, they're in their favored time of day. And so it would be good fortune for them. So the triplicity rulers played a very important role in this period in Chinese astrology, and this was all carried over from abroad. There's also, interestingly, in the Japanese tradition, there's kind of something unique that I found in one of the horoscopes from the 12th century. So the Japanese tradition, which reproduced the Chinese tradition, so the Japanese tradition inherited the Chinese tradition starting around the 10th century. And you also see the triplicity rulers there. And in this case, each of the triplicity rulers are connected to each of the 12 houses and the themes associated with it. So it says here, triplicity rulers of the ascendant, Mars, Venus, and Moon. And so these will have a strong connection to fate via the ascendant. So you look at the triplicity rulers of the ascendant, and that has a very strong relationship to the themes of the ascendant. And then when he's looking at the triplicity rulers of the 10th house, he says that these planets will have a strong connection to prosperity and office. So in this case, you're looking, so for example, if you looked at the triplicity rulers of the 10th, so that's your career, that's your office, then those are the planets that will govern over the themes of work and career and professional development. So we would assume that the same would apply for example, the triplicity rulers of the 8th house would have a lot of connection to death and illness and those sort of topics. The 2nd house to fortune and wealth and that sort of thing. And that's what we see here. So the triplicity rulers of fortune, the 11th house, these will have a strong connection to fortune for the native. This isn't something that I think is explicitly spelled out in Dorotheus's text, as far as I can recall, but it makes sense. Logically, it makes sense that you would look at the triplicity rulers. This is similar to looking at the condition of the domicile rulers. So for example, if the domicile ruler of the second is Mars, like for example, if your second house is Scorpio, you look to the condition of Mars. What is the condition of Mars in the chart? In this case, you're looking at the triplicity rulers of the house as well. And so in European astrology, they tended to favor the domicile rulers, whereas in this tradition, they also focus on the triplicity rulers, which also, again, kind of highlights the influence of Dorotheus of Sidon. Another concept which is unique to the Chinese tradition, but seems to probably have a origin in an earlier foreign tradition, is called the womb sign. So the sign in which the moon occupies prior to the birth of the native is called the womb sign. I'll explain this. So this was discussed in the 16th century, who cited much earlier sources, which probably, again, go back to around the year 800. But what is this womb sign? The sign which the moon transited is called the womb sign. The moon is located there 3 days prior to birth. So in practice, this refers to the sign immediately preceding the natal position of the moon, rather than an exact calculated degree. And I'll show you what that means. It means this. So you look at the position of the moon, which is the body sign, and then you look at the immediately preceding sign, and that is the womb. And that represents the experience and the fate of the native before they're born. So the 9 months while they're in the womb of the mother, that's the sort of things that are associated with this womb sign. And then there's also this concept of the postnatal 3-day sign, which is where the moon, which is the sign that immediately follows the position of the moon. And that indicates things that happen after the birth. So it's looking at things that happen before the birth and then after the birth as well. So as one of the examples that the text gives is this sort of configuration. It says, for instance, if Scorpio is the womb sign, Mars is the ruling planet of the sign. If Libra, Taurus, or Leo are at the ascendant, Mars will be damaging if out of favored sect. And I'll show you in a graph what all of this means. And it goes on to say, if Mars and the sun are conjunct, then it indicates harm to the father, while the native is in the mother's womb. If Mars and the moon are together, then it indicates that immediately preceding the birth, the mother will be beset with disaster and difficulty in giving birth. So this is making predictions about what will happen while the native is in the womb. So let me illustrate how this works. So in this sort of configuration, we have the moon in Sagittarius, so the womb sign becomes Scorpio. So Scorpio is ruling the womb sign, so that's Mars. And in this sort of configuration, Libra and Taurus are in opposition to Aries and Scorpio, the domicile rulers. And Leo, the solar sign, is also unfavorable to Mars. So that's why it's mentioning the ascendant as well. And then if Mars is conjunct with the sun, then it shows that Mars is causing damage to the father. And this indicates that something will happen to the father prior to the birth of the native, or it happened prior to the birth of the native. And then conversely, if Mars is conjunct the moon, then this indicates that there's harm to the mother of the native prior to the birth. So this is a unique example in astrology where for most practical purposes, this would be a retroactive review of what happened before the native was born. Because in order to produce a horoscope, you have to know when somebody was born. So this would require that you're doing this after they're born. And so you'd be attempting to determine what happened to the mother or the father before they were born. So you get into these very complex configurations that could indicate various things, and it's all very clearly explained in the Chinese. And another concept, which of course is attested, is that of aspect. Although it's an important part of Hellenistic astrology, and it's attested in the Chinese and Japanese sources, but they use whole sign configurations in this period. They don't use degree-based measurements. It's all based on whole sign aspects. So as we know, like in Claudius Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, he focuses on degree-based aspects. And then later on in the medieval tradition, they tend to emphasize degree-based configurations with aspect, whereas it's entirely based on whole sign configurations. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is a sort of applied astrology in the Japanese tradition, which is the star mandalas. So in medieval Japan, they had the ordinary Buddhist mandalas, which depict the Buddha and the various deities and so forth. But Sukuyōdō, the Japanese astrologer monks, created a unique tradition of star mandalas. And we're looking at the famous star mandala that's in the New York Met Museum. And it's not a typical Buddhist mandala because it's primarily concerned with the planets and the stars. And it has a specific astrological origin, or it has an explicit astrological configuration. So what happened was basically, I was approached by one of the curators of a former curator of the museum, and they pointed out that the planets relative to the zodiac signs are all kind of clustered together. They're not evenly spaced out. And they said, could this represent a horoscope? And I said that actually it probably could. So I looked at the positions of the planets relative to the zodiac signs. And as we know, Saturn and Jupiter will only be in this sort of configuration once every 30 years or so. So I was told by the art historian that roughly speaking, it's either 13th or 14th century. So I got a window of about 200 years. So I found every 30 years we have when Saturn is in Capricorn, and then I look, so Saturn is in Capricorn, and when is Jupiter in Sag in this sort of configuration? And then I found an approximate time. And then I found the Sun, Libra, et cetera, and I found a period in 1225 when most of the planets align with what you would see in this mandala. But there's two things. The first thing is that the moon is not in an accurate position, but that's because they couldn't accurately calculate the position of the moon because they didn't have a formula for taking into account the lunar apogee. Because as we know, the velocity of the moon, the speed of the moon changes over time, and you have to have a very solid formula to calculate that over time. So the moon isn't in an accurate position. And then also Ketu, which is normally the descending node of the moon, is actually the lunar apogee in this case. But that's because in the Japanese tradition, instead of using Ketu as the descending node of the moon, they used Ketu as the lunar apogee. Different from the Daoist tradition in China. But the whole point here is that they made a star mandala that's based on a horoscope. So the positions of the planets relative to the zodiac signs is actually in this sort of configuration. And so it's an applied form of astrology. And why would they do this? It's most likely for some sort of ritual purpose, because probably somebody, a very eminent person, an aristocrat or a member of the imperial family, requested that they create this mandala, which represents probably somebody's horoscope, their nativity, and then they would do offerings, like ritual offerings to the planets, to worship them and to request, that disaster not happen, that good fortunes come. And so the astrologers were also magicians. They were also practicing magicians at the same time. And we also see some of the familiar iconography of the earlier period of Buddhist iconography. And some of this also has some Indo-Iranian motifs as well. But the iconography would be familiar to us as well. Like Mars is this very wrathful looking warrior with a bow and arrow and weapons and so forth. And then in some cases, Venus, the music player, Mercury, the scribe, And then Scorpio becomes something. He looks like a prawn. He's actually probably in this case something like halfway between a scorpion and a prawn or a shrimp or something like that. But that's because I think they, if you lived in medieval Japan, you probably never actually saw a scorpion up close. So the artist probably didn't really know what a scorpion was. So the tradition ends up turning it into a prawn or a shrimp over time. And it's interesting that Mercury in East Asia is always depicted as a woman. And the reason that Mercury is a woman in East Asia is because Mercury is associated with young women. So the artists, they saw, okay, Saturn, old man, so they depicted him as an old man. And Mercury is associated with young women, so they associated Mercury with young women, and they always depicted her as a woman. And so most of the time in the iconography of astrology, Mercury is depicted as a male, like Hermes, Mercury in the European and the Greek and Latin traditions. Whereas in East Asia, it's always a lady. And then you have Ketu, so this wrathful figure riding atop a bull, and then Gemini. Gemini is not necessarily the twins. It's often depicted as a man and a woman, as a married couple. And then in this mandala, you also have the lunar mansion. So this is Indian iconography. So this is Ashvini. So in Sanskrit, the word Ashva means horse. So Ashvini is named with this sort of element of horse. So that's why Ashvini is riding a horse. And then one of them is called Shavana. And you can see that the deity is holding a chakra, like a disc and a conch shell, like a seashell. And he's riding a bird. And this is actually the god Vishnu. And the reason for this is that the lunar mansions in the Indian tradition were associated with Indian gods. So Shravana was associated with the god Vishnu. And that's why in this depiction, Shravana is riding the Garuda and has all of the features of Vishnu, because it's actually Vishnu. So there's also this Indian iconography that comes in. Although not all of the mandalas in Japan necessarily were horoscopes. In some cases, it's just more of like a generic depiction of all of the celestial deities, the planets, lunar mansions, zodiac signs, the Big Dipper, that sort of thing. They're quite elegantly produced. In modern Japan today, they still have offerings to the star mandala. So in the temples, once a year, they'll put the star mandala up and they'll do a ritual offering to all of the planets and the stars. And this is, the idea is it will bring about good fortune for the coming year. They come in different shapes. So they can come in this rectangular form or in a circular form. And then as you get closer to the modern period, Scorpio becomes more and more like a shrimp or a prawn. And so if you look at like a modern star mandala today that was produced by an artist today, they follow the traditional manuals of art, of iconography, and Scorpio ends up being a prawn. So he starts off as a scorpion, and then over time he becomes a prawn. So I thank you very, very much for your attention, and I welcome any sort of questions. Yeah.
So last question.
Yes.
First is what January in the Chinese tradition. So one of the things that I participated in most was studying the Islamic tradition and seeing all of the speaking of the ancient Siasa between the Xinjiang.
Right.
In the description of the exaltation of beings, it's quite so people that will be non-binary, trans, gender fluidity in the Chinese tradition.
I had in the Chinese astrological text, there's no mention of gender fluidity. There's just this one discussion very briefly about sexuality. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's the next question. Those two perfections, so perfection.
Right.
And I was wondering if there was any sort of it was like tradition, see like stuff for that reason. So I was wondering if that was compliments.
Yeah, there's something like the directions. That sort of concept. I didn't go into it here because it's just I don't really understand it 100% either, but there is a system of directions that's described in some of the Chinese texts as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, please. Oh, that's where the sun
either turns northward or southward. The solstice, those are the solstice signs. So that would be the tropical signs. That's when the sun turns. Yeah. Yeah, Aries, Libra. I hope I'm getting that right. Or is it the summer ones? Yeah, it's the summer one. It's not summer. Cancer and Capricorn. Yes, it's Cancer and Capricorn. Yeah, it's the signs where there's the seasonal shift. Yeah. Yes, because in this system they're using whole sign configuration, so it's the house, not the degree. Yeah, it's not a degree-based house system or a degree-based lot system. It's house-based, so it's entirely house-based. Yeah, it's easy to calculate. Then you just like see, oh, it's 3, 4, and then you just release it from the ascendant. You don't have to do the actual like degree calculations. It's never actually mentioned degree calculations for this. Yeah, you assume because it takes 3 days for the moon to go from one sign to another. So it's not like an exact degree. It just assumes it's the sign immediately before the position of the moon. So there's like the house or the sign that the moon is in. The sign immediately before that is considered the sign of the womb sign. Yeah. Please.
Sorry to go back to the branches. I noticed that in some traditions, there was the Zodiac signs for the branches. You see that they became used at some point in the past.
Yeah, the earthly branches in the Chinese system were used as shorthand for the zodiac signs. Yeah, because there's 12 earthly branches, and they're basically used as shorthand for, right. So instead of writing out, for example, like white ram sign for Aries, they could just use one of the earthly branches. Yeah. Something like that. That seems to be how it was used in this case. Yeah. Yes.
There's one question here. Someone asks about the concept of is 7 degrees from the star. Is something that this year has a question. Someone Japanese.
Abe no seimei. Okay. That's coming from a different tradition. That's on Myodo. That's not Sukuyōdō. So in Japan there was a tradition that's associated with the Shinto religion called On Myodo, which is the way of yin and yang, but that was different from Sukuyōdō, which is the Buddhist astrologer monks. So the concept that's being alluded to here, I've not seen it before in the Buddhist tradition of astrology in Japan.
Just a few moments.
Please.
I'm trying to say, body sign. So they don't have access to the chart because we have bodies and bone. So that is completely lacking in these traditions.
It might have been there. I just don't see it. I don't see it. Yeah.
But because I didn't see that. As far as I know. So the other thing we still learn in tradition is that is about
Yes.
just to say I'm not but it's going right up or do that.
Right.
And you see it, so it's probably something that's probably well probably don't get it's following that.
Right.
Another thing I wanted to ask you, several
in the Chinese system?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question. Originally, it seems they were using a tropical zodiac that was projected onto the Chinese system of sidereal lunar mansions. Now, that sounds very complex, but what it means, though, is that the first degree of Aries was calibrated to the vernal equinox. And there's one line in one text where it explicitly says that first degree of Aries, vernal equinox, which means it's a tropical zodiac. But when they're actually positioning the planets, they don't use zodiac signs. They don't say the planet Venus is 3rd degrees Aries. They'll actually use the Chinese lunar mansion, because that's how Chinese astronomy works, is they use lunar mansions as coordinates. But they have to convert that into zodiac signs. And the way they did that originally was first degree Aries, vernal equinox. Later on, when you look at the tables in like the 16th century, that has sort of disappeared. And I don't know what their logic is for dividing the zodiac signs at that point. It's still approximate, like it's kind of approximate, but it's no longer very strictly tied to the seasonal markers. But it's not like a sidereal zodiac from like the Jyotish tradition, for example. It becomes something else.
But it's very interesting because we're seeing, mathematical depictions, cultural mathematical depictions, because they're using systems of coordinates. And of course, what I think is very interesting since the beginning is that we've seen the same kind of symbols and mechanics and logic.
Right.
That was just
Right.
changes. Now certain symbology is maintained,
Mhm.
more symbology, well, I think you could say that is maintained, but then I believe that specific
Right.
themes,
Right.
just saying,
Right. Well, so like the lot of spirit, where the sun is Taoism and moon is Buddhism, that wouldn't make sense in a European context. But if you're trying to translate this and adapt it to the local area, but it also begs the question, so why is Taoism solar and why is Buddhism lunar, right? And so I looked at Picatrix, Gayat al-Hakim, and it said moon idol worship. And I'm thinking maybe it has something to do with that moon is associated with idol worship. And Buddhism, by extension, would be associated with that because of the worship of statues in particular. And Taoism is a solar religion. It could be at the time that Taoism was associated with the imperial family, so sun, solar. Maybe Zoroastrianism was associated with the sun in the Persian context, although I can't explicitly say that because I don't know. In Europe, Christianity is a solar religion. And it's also associated with like kingship and so forth. Right. Really? Okay. Because I think Picatrix says that it's solar. It varies. Yeah.
It depends who's writing.
It depends who's writing. Right. In the medieval tradition, categorically, Judaism was associated with Saturn. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Right.
It's usually. Questions, please. I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Astro project. Shield and the Absolute project has also supported us in this endeavor. Material project, of course.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's lovely.
Thank you very much.